hope things are good in your world. I'm going to start off today with a Stratocaster. You may never have heard of these before because they are kind of rare, but they have gained some small popularity in a few musical subcultures, so it's a good idea for you to be able to identify one if you see it. This guy here just needs a little bit of a setup. Oh, she's a sweet ride. Seems to have been made in 2008. The owner had the black pickguard put in to customize it a bit. One of the things he's keen on is tuning up the tremolo. He's got it set for a hard return, so it's not floating, it comes back to rest on the body. But when he releases it, it really smacks back hard with a serious clunk, and operation takes some muscle. So this is one of the first things I want to rectify in a setup on this kind of guitar, because it could affect other parts of the setup down the road. This is a 2-point bridge system, and it seems to me that the springs are probably tighter than necessary. Really, I think we just want enough tension to hold the back of the bridge in the plane that we want it. In this case, level with the body, or maybe a hair's width higher. If we wanted this to float, in other words, have the ability to pull up and raise the pitch of a note, we would raise the entire bridge up about 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch off the body, and set the springs to hold it at that level, basically parallel with the top of the guitar. So the height of the bridge is controlled by these screws here. The angle at which the bridge sits relative to the top is controlled by the tension of the springs in the tremolo system. So you got strings versus springs. That's something that can take a little bit of balancing, especially in a floating trem, to be honest. When the guitar is tuned to pitch, the tension from the springs has to perfectly equal the tension from the strings. Otherwise, the bridge will sit at a funny slant and it won't really function the way you want it to, and it'll look weird. For setup purposes, it's actually a good thing to have that excess string pull, because I can get this thing in tune and then back off on the springs until we reach that balance point. Before we do that, I'm going to take my usual measurements. I'll check the action and the neck relief. If need be, I'll adjust the truss rod so the neck is the way I want it. So the action here at the 12th fret, I measure at the 12th. Some people like the 17th. The difference is minimal. Is actually quite good. Just a little over 3/64 on the outside strings, which is considerably lower than Fender's factory spec, which would be 4/64. The interior strings, however, there's some variance in height. The saddles are not set to the same radius as the fingerboard, so these are like a full 1/64 of an inch lower, which is considerable. I wonder if we get buzzing in the middle. Just a little bit. That probably doesn't come through the amp. I probably want to raise those up just a hair. Okay, with a capo on the 1st fret and holding down the lower E string somewhere around the body joint, I'm going to measure the relief between the top of the fret and the underside of the E string somewhere around the 6th fret, like I normally do. And I've noticed that we are at about, well, it's a scant 3/1000 clearance there, which is low. Fender's factory spec is around 10/1000. This is not wrong. You can sometimes get away with setting up a neck with little or no relief. Generally speaking, though, I would want a little bit more, because this could be fine in summer. Come winter, seasonal changes could cause this to enter into a back bow, at which point you've got all kinds of issues. So I might loosen the truss rod just a tiny little hair. We're talking 2/1000 extra here. I want 5/1000 rather than 3. So I want a little bit more relief. I'll loosen the truss rod, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, just a little bit, like that. Now my 5/1000 feeler gauge slides in between there just perfectly. So I'll check and see what that did to the action. Nothing. It's essentially the same as it was. quick and dirty check of the intonation to make sure we're not super far off. Okay, besides the sheer effort involved in operating the bar, there are a couple other things that lead me to suspect the springs in this trem system are a little too tight. The first is the Inertia Block, which is this big metal piece where the strings go into. In this guitar, it's pitched very far forward. Ordinarily, they're closer to upright. So much so in this case, it would be difficult to change strings, I think, without either depressing the bar or taking off the cover plate. The other thing we might be able to see, maybe, from the side here, is that actually the front edge of this bridge is taller or higher than the back edge. It's ramped up this way, which is not great. It can cause a problem that, well, actually the customer described it. He said that it was sort of like the difference between a logarithmic volume pot and an audio taper. So you can actually push the bar for quite a ways before it actually feels like it's getting anywhere. Like all of the effect happens, you know, after a while. That can happen if these two screws have been backed out too far and raising the front edge of the bridge too much, because you've got to overcome a distance before things actually start working. The other thing is, like, it is stiff, and it does come back pretty sharply. There is a lot of tension behind it. Let's see what we're working with back here. Okay, so we've got 3 springs, which is pretty typical. But you can see how far the claw has been screwed in towards the front edge of its trough here. This, yeah, this does seem like quite a ways. Okay, those are all slacked off now. Now I'm going to turn these in carefully till they're completely bottomed out. There's no movement there. Bottomed out. I'm going to loosen them 1/2 turn each. That should give us enough room to play with. Now I'm going to retune carefully. With the mounting screws lowered and the strings up to pitch again, the action is now too low. But I don't care at this point. I'll take care of it later. Right now I'm concerned with equalizing the spring to string tension, and in order to help visualize that, I'm going to take a piece of thin shim stock here. In this case it's a piece of string packet because they're always around and they're about the right thickness, and it's about 4/1000 of an inch, which is like 0.1 millimeters, so very thin. I slip it under the back edge of the bridge and it's clamped there by the spring tension. Now I'll gradually loosen the spring claw until this just releases and pulls out. That's the magic balancing point. This works the same way for a floating system, though in that case I'd use a thicker shim. If you don't do it like this, you're constantly retuning, changing the claw location, retuning again, finding that you've overshot and the bridge is tipped backwards or forwards, so you start the whole process over again. It's very frustrating and it takes all day. This is pretty quick. I'm going to do this in about 1/2 turn increments, working both sides, keeping that claw, the front edge of it, basically parallel with the front edge of the recess there. Still too tight. Still too tight. Now this bar is much more expressive, sort of like fingertip control. And you can rest your hand on the bridge and you're not going to be inadvertently pulling it sharp. For these pivot points here and similar parts, recently I've been using Bow Shield T9, which is a protectant and lubricant used in the aircraft industry. It's sort of a non-dirty lubricant, and it leaves behind a kind of waxy surface that's long-lasting, and it's pretty good for this kind of stuff. Let's spend some time cleaning and polishing the frets as well. I'll adjust the string height so that those inner strings are conforming to the radius. A couple of strings were pretty far off in terms of intonation. I have to move the saddles. And then I need to dial in the pickup height. So that's set up and ready to go. I'll play it a little bit here so you can hear the pickups. I don't really play with the whammy bar all that often, so excuse my feeble attempts. And then there's some crack work to do. I don't know why exactly, but this past winter season has been particularly bad for acoustic cracks. Maybe having more people at home with time on their hands meant more playing, which led to more guitars being left on stands or propped against the wall drying out. Regardless, I've faced a whole bunch of these in recent weeks. This one's a Yamaha. It's got a solid top. It's not too old. These ones in the upper bout, you really got to get after those. Don't leave them for too long, because if they start to deform the rosette or break into the sound hole, that's when things get really nasty. They're hard to fix. And here we have a nice Taylor 810 with exactly the same issue. Cracks, to be honest, are not my favorite thing to deal with. They're rarely satisfying. I mean, it feels good to get things patched up and structurally sound, but it's rare to make them disappear completely, especially if they've been open for a while like this one. I always tell people that you're probably going to end up seeing them forever, you know. They become part of the guitar's history. They're a war wound. You can mend them up and they'll be slightly scarred, but, you know, it's never going to be the way it was previously. It'll function just fine, but you're going to see it. Let's talk about humidification. There are people who like to force humidify or take the instrument and put it in conditions that are so damp the wood will swell beyond its reasonable limits in hopes of making cracks like this really tight for gluing. I think that works in cases where the instrument is exceptionally, abnormally dry to begin with. I'll do it myself from time to time. I'll hang it up in a plastic bag with a wet cloth in there for a couple of days. But if a guitar is at normal levels of humidification, that trick is kind of fraught with danger, because you're hoping that when the wood inevitably shrinks back to equilibrium with its environment, that it's going to be okay. And there are a few things in this world that will prevent re-cracking if the wood is prone to it. If you can't close the crack with light pressure and normal humidity, you're probably better off filling it with something, which most guitar people don't want to do because it's really difficult to color match and make a patch like that go away completely. If a crack has been open for some time, the wood tends to darken with exposure to the air, and depending on the location it's stored, it might also collect dirt. Like, don't ever try and clean a guitar with an open crack by swiping over it with a cloth, because you're just going to force it all down into the furrow, and it's really difficult to get them to look clean again. So this one is always going to be kind of a dark line, I suspect. In this case, with my crossbody clamp on here tightened to reasonable levels, I've still got a gap of about 7/1000ths of an inch, which is like the thickness of 2 sheets of paper that won't close up. This guitar is currently at, living in conditions of 47% humidity. Don't really want it to be wetter than that. I'm not going to try and force humidify this. I think in this case we'll need a little thin splint to take up that extra width. Sometimes it's useful to check out cracks in the dark with a light behind them. For instance, these cracks up here are so tight that no light comes through. Glue alone is going to be sufficient to hold these together. I'll commence with making the filler material, the splint or spline. This is an old piece of spruce soundboard. Cut off a piece and then scrape it to thickness using my binding scraper. When it's sized properly, it slides right into the joint nicely without being too tight because it's going to swell a little bit. Here's a flexible piece of plastic I'll use to try and keep the 2 halves of the joint level during gluing. That's pretty important. On the inside I'll use cawls, smaller ones, faced with cork. This top is a radius, so it's a balance. You don't want to clamp it dead flat because then it just looks deformed and it probably won't go together very well. But I do want to keep the 2 sides aligned along that slightly curved surface. Even a simple job like this can be made slightly difficult because you're introducing moisture into the wood at the joint and potentially also between the surface of the wood and the film of finish that's on top of it. Sometimes it wants to delaminate a little bit at that point. Softwood, like this spruce soundboard, it's compressible. Like, say, when you push it through a thickness sander, which is what happened at the Taylor factory. It gets squeezed a little bit. But if you subsequently wet that surface, like with glue, it can spring up and regain some of that dimension that was crushed down. And it doesn't shrink all the way back, so you can end up with a bulge. If you come back and want to flatten it, depending on the thickness of the lacquer, there might not be enough there, and you could sand all the way through it. So, like I say, unless you're willing to add a lot of extra finish, basically like refinishing the top, this is never going to look pristine. I'm going to use a protein-based glue here. In this case, this is fish glue. You could use hide glue. I'll pump the glue through to the other side using a small suction cup. Then I'll slide the splint in there and cut it off flush with the top using a razor blade. Clean up the excess glue and then clamp it. I want to let this dry for at least a day, and the longer the better. On this Yamaha, the frets are getting a bit worn. They've been dressed down once before. The height is currently about 30/1000ths, 0.75 millimeters. But you can see that there are deep grooves that have been worn in through the path of the E and B strings. I have no easy way of measuring those, but it's gone through at least half the remaining fret height. These probably started life at around 40/1000ths or 1 millimeter tall. Modern frets are usually between 40 and 55/1000ths. If someone asks for very tall frets, usually they're doing that because they think they can get some extra mileage out of them. But you have to be careful because they might not know what effect that can have if you're not used to playing tall frets. If you play with heavy pressure from your fretting fingers, which is something that often develops with low frets, to be honest, the extra height translates to more room in which you can stretch the string and, heavy-handed chords start to play out of tune. So I'm going to replace these with, something like 40/1000ths. By about the same width. These are probably around 80/1000ths width. Yeah. So these are pretty standard. This is the kind of fret you'd find on a Martin guitar. So only the first 4 frets here are really affected. So I'm only going to replace 4. No sense in doing the whole board if I don't have to. I've done a lot of refretting videos in the last 6 months or so. So I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm going to score along each fret just lightly. This helps break through any crud that's there in the corner, but it also, when it comes time to pry the frets up, prevents any damage caused by the little spiky things on the side of the fret from running out into the portion of the board that's visible. Kind of halts those splits in their tracks. I'll heat these up with a soldering iron, and I'll pull them out and then clean the slots. This tool is sized to fit the slot exactly. I can also use this small hooked X-Acto blade. I notch the ends of the frets so they'll fit over the binding. And I've got a little bit of glue in the slot already here. Hold that in place, tap in the ends so it's secure, and pound it home. I'll clean off any of the glue that's squeezed out. I'll trim off the overhanging ends. And then dress them down so that they're angled. Then I'll level, recrown, and polish them. Even after being clamped flat while gluing, you can still see the slight ripple effect in this Yamaha upper bout. I'm going to fill the crack just to seal it and give me a little bit of room to level slightly using thin super glue. To support the cracks from the underside, I'll make and glue in some spruce cleats. This is some soundboard material again. I'll mark it out, slice it off, plane it, and bring it to thickness, which is somewhere around 1/16 of an inch, 60 thousandths, 1.5 millimeters. They don't have to be outrageously thick. I need to do a preliminary leveling with a razor blade scraper because I'll be using magnets to hold the cleats in place, and I want a flat surface against which they can rest. This sort of delicate work. The razor blade has pieces of tape on either corner to hold it just slightly above the surface, and I kind of bend it down in the middle and do some light sanding with a flat block as well using 1000 and 1200 grit. I'll also do the coarse polishing using a foam pad and automotive abrasive compounds. With a cleat held to the magnet with just a little bit of double-sided tape, I can glue it in place. Okay, I think we're going to call it here for this video. Got the Yamaha done. The Taylor, I've still got to put a pickup into it. I don't know if I have enough time to get that done tonight and get this video up for Saturday afternoon. But you can see this thing it's in pretty good shape. I can't tell whether it's made in 1991 or 2001. I suspect 91. The Yamaha serial numbers are funny that way. So, there's still some ripple. You can feel it, actually, when you rub your hand over it. That expanding grain thing that goes on. But now it's been sealed up with some super glue. It's reasonably shiny and ready to keep playing.